What happens when those chosen by God begin to question his authority? Not outsiders, not enemies, but leaders, men who were called, men who were chosen, men who stood close to holy things, and yet they wanted more recognition, more authority, more control. The wilderness was quiet, but beneath that silence, something dangerous was forming. Frustration, dissatisfaction, and the slow creeping belief that things were not fair. The sun was relentless. Day after day, the same horizon, the same dust, the same waiting. Nothing seemed to change. And when people wait too long, something inside begins to shift. They forget what God has already done. They forget the miracles. They forget the deliverance. They forget the mercy. And slowly, gratitude fades, and frustration rises. And frustration always leads somewhere. It leads to comparison. And comparison quietly opens the door to pride. The journey had been long. The people were tired, exhausted in body and restless in spirit. Step after step, day after day, still no promised land. And when people grow weary, they begin to question. They begin to compare. They begin to wonder, why them and not me? In the middle of this growing tension stood a man named Korah, a Levite, not an outsider, not forgotten. He was chosen, set apart for service in the house of God. But even sacred assignment was no longer enough for him. Something had shifted, something subtle, something dangerous. What he had no longer satisfied him. Honor felt small. Service felt limiting. Calling felt restrictive. And comparison was now speaking louder than gratitude. And so Korah began to speak, quietly at first, carefully, strategically. He didn't start with rebellion. He started with questions. And questions can sometimes sound righteous. He didn't shout. He whispered. And whispers spread faster than fire. He gathered others, not weak men, not unknown men, but leaders. 250 men, respected, recognized, influential, men whose words carried weight, men who shaped opinion, men who influenced direction. And this is what made it dangerous, because influence is never neutral. It builds or it destroys. And together they approached Moses, bold, united, confident. They stood before him and said, "You take too much upon yourself. All the congregation is holy. Why do you lift yourself above us?" It sounded fair. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like justice. But not everything that sounds right is right, because behind their words was something deeper. Not justice, not truth, not equality, pride. And pride always disguises itself as righteousness. Moses didn't respond with anger. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. Instead, he fell on his face. Silence. Because Moses understood something they had forgotten. This was not about him. It was not about position. It was not about status. It was about calling. And calling does not come from man. It comes from God. Moses rose and spoke calmly. "Tomorrow, the Lord will show who belongs to him." A test was set. Each man would take a censer. Each man would stand before God, and God himself would reveal the truth. But before judgment came, mercy spoke. Moses cried out to the people, "Separate yourselves, move away from these men." There was still time, still a moment, still a chance to turn back. But pride does not like turning back. It always insists that it is right. The moment grew heavier. The air felt different. Some stepped back, slowly, carefully. Others stayed, unmoved. Families watched in silence. Children clung tightly to their parents, because something in the atmosphere had changed. This was no longer just leadership conflict. This was separation. A line had been drawn, and not everyone crossed it safely. Korah stood firm, defiant, unshaken, completely convinced he was right. The ground beneath them was still, too still, almost as if creation itself was holding its breath. Then a rumble, low, deep, unnatural. The earth began to move. A crack formed, then widened, and widened again. And suddenly, the ground opened. Not a crack, not a split, an opening. People screamed. Some ran. Some froze. Some couldn't even move. Dust filled the air. The sound was overwhelming. It was not just earth shifting. It was judgment breaking through creation. Visible, undeniable, final. Korah and those with him were swallowed, gone, in an instant. No battle, no escape, no negotiation, only judgment. The earth closed again, as if nothing had happened. But it wasn't over. The 250 men still stood, holding their censers, still refusing, still resisting, still convinced. Then fire came, not from man, from God. It consumed them instantly, a holy response to unholy pride. And just like that, what began as disagreement ended in devastation. What began as words ended in silence. Because when God responds, there is nothing left to say. Silence fell across the camp, heavy, complete, final. No one moved. No one spoke. Because everyone understood. God had answered, not with debate, not with discussion, but with power. This story is not just about judgment. It is about the heart. Korah was not rejected. He was chosen. But he wanted more than what God had given. And that desire became destruction. Because when we reject God's order, we don't rise. We fall. So ask yourself, are you walking in obedience or resisting what God has placed in your life? Because not all rebellion is loud. Not all pride is obvious. Sometimes it hides behind fairness. Sometimes it hides behind questions. Sometimes it hides behind comparison. But God sees deeper. He sees the heart. And He knows when we are surrendering and when we are trying to take control. God sees the heart.